It's Moser with a quick tutorial on the introduction to the ecology of populations. This is largely material drawn from chapter 20 in your biology textbook with a lot of extra stuff thrown in. So to start off, let's talk about what populations are. A population is a group of organisms that belong to the same species and live in a particular place at the same time. Now, sadly, as the human population grows in many places, the population of other species, other wildlife species, tends to decline. There are only so many resources to go around. In order to study populations, we tend to look at different properties of those populations. The first of them is size, and this is the one that everybody makes the mistake of saying population is how many there are. Well, no, that's population size. So population size is how many individuals there are in the population, but measuring that actual size can be really tough. You can either have so many individuals that they're impossible to count, or they can be spread out over great big areas of land, or they're always on the move. Imagine counting mosquitoes. Ooh, it's a lot of them on a summer night. Here we've got some feral horses out west. Again, they're a very mobile species, and they're spread out over great distances. Hard to count, so how do you count them? Well, when it isn't possible to count every member of a population, we do what's called sampling. And in a sample, we estimate the population based on the number of individuals in a certain area. I've talked a little bit before about my experiences with fish in the Division of Wildlife Department of Fisheries. Part of what we did was sampling. For instance, sampling muskie. Bear with me, that's my very terrible muskie. If you have a body of water of a known size, and you know approximately how much territory muskies tend to take up, then if you put nets down covering a given percentage of the lake, and you see how many muskie you capture over some period of time, you can estimate how many muskie there are in the whole lake. You can do the same thing with plants in a field by looking at the entire field and then selectively measuring a given area of it, called a quadrat. We're going to pop this right down over a specific area. We can count the number of each species we find inside that block, and then we can estimate the number of that species that we would find in the entire area. This is really commonly done with plant species, things that don't move. Sampling is also how things like the population of states in the U.S. are done. Not every household gets a census form, but a given percentage of households get a census form, and when they fill those out, the Census Bureau estimates the number of humans living in the U.S. Now, another thing that we think about when we're talking about populations is their density. That's how crowded the population is. It's the number of individuals per unit area. And once we know that density number, we can try to take a guess at how many individuals there are in a total area of land. If we think about this in terms of human population density, there is a much lower density of humans here in rural Idaho than there is in some place like Manhattan. So this is low density, and this is high density. We can find similar things with animal species, though I don't think there are any animals that live as closely packed as humans do in large cities. For an avian example, we have these penguins living in giant colonies, very densely packed. It's a high density situation. Or this beautiful little kestrel, who really only has anything to do with any others of its species when they're mating and rearing their young. Other than that, they're pretty solitary organisms, and they tend to have territories. So therefore, they tend to be low density populations. Well, if we're thinking about how densely populated they are, we might want to also think about their dispersion pattern, or how they're spread out in their area. So dispersion is the spatial distribution of individuals within a population, how close together they are. There are three basic dispersion patterns that we'll talk about: clumped, even, and random. Let's talk about clumped first. We find organisms living in clumped distributions usually related to either food or living space, nesting space. There can also be a social reason to be clumped. Just like you want to hang out with others of your kind, your friends, a lot of animals also hang out with members of their own species. They have social behavior. They may protect one another. They may be caring for young. Flocking behavior is the same thing. Now, just because a couple of living things are standing near one another doesn't mean that they have a regularly clumped distribution. When we say clumped distribution, we're talking about a pattern of behavior where they're typically found in groups rather than on their own. Of course, this presents some problems for sampling the population to estimate population size. Think back to a fish survey. These are obviously not musky, but these weird little pink fish. If they're a fish that tends to travel in schools, which a lot of ocean fish do, then some poor biologist, could sample the body of water and find no fish and grossly underestimate the population. They could also sample the area where all the fish are at some point and overestimate the population. So again, clumped distributions can be caused by social behavior or because that's where the food is. Even distributions also often result from social interactions, but usually this is a more of a, hey, you, back off and give me some space. We see this with colonial nesting behavior, where some species of birds will nest at very even intervals, so everybody is a wingspan away from everybody else. We also see this temporarily in things like V patterns in flight of waterfowl that are migrating. But very often the even distribution results from a social interaction, such as making sure that there's space enough between nests, or one individual who's guarding their territory and keeping everyone else out. That said, even distributions tend to make sampling much easier for biologists. And then we have the random distribution. We don't usually find random distributions in animal species. There are a few exceptions, but we talk a lot more about random distribution in plant species, and very often it's because seeds are dispersed by the wind or by birds. So it typically has a random distribution of various species of trees. Oops, pardon the bumping back a slide. The one exception to my note that you don't usually find this in animal species would be organisms that are in bodies of water that don't actually move themselves but allow the current to carry them. So we do find some things in the ocean, very small ocean animals, who just drift. And there you would tend to see a pretty random distribution. Okay, with that, you'll have a simulator for tomorrow, and you should work on your vocabulary. See you soon.